The annual company gala was in full swing, and I found myself standing by the bar, slowly sipping on a glass of whiskey. Somewhere amidst the lively crowd was my wife, Natalie. I had spent most of the evening scanning the room, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. The air was filled with the smooth sound of jazz, and the steady clink of glasses formed a backdrop to the hum of contralto. People moved gracefully across the floor, their laughter and polite chatter echoing off the walls. The things between Natalie and me had been tense for weeks. We barely exchanged words at home, though once frequent smiles now rare. The warmth we once shared had turned cold, distant. Tonight I had hoped we could talk, maybe reconnect. That's why I agreed to attend this gala with her, despite my reservations. Yet as the minutes passed, I hadn't seen her. Then I finally spotted her near the dance floor, standing far too close to her boss, Richard. The sight of her laughing at something he said, her smile beaming, made my stomach churn. Richard was always around, always too friendly with her, but I had never let it bother me. I trusted Natalie, at least I had, but now something felt different. I gripped my glass tighter as I watched them from afar. Richard leaned in close, whispering something into her ear, and Natalie tilted her head back, laughing a sound that grated on my nerves. Her hand slid up his arm, lingering just a bit too long. I tried to convince myself it was a harmless gesture. I had no reason to doubt her, no proof of anything. But then I heard her say something that made the ground beneath me feel like it shifted. "He thinks I'm his little wife, poor hubby," she murmured. "I'm not his property." Her voice was low but clear enough for me to hear as she leaned even closer to Richard. Disbelief clouded my mind. "I'm an independent woman," she continued. "I don't need that loser watching over me. If he doesn't find out, no harm done." My breath caught in my throat, my thoughts racing to make sense of her words. Had I misheard her? Did she really say that? A mocking smirk tugged at the corners of her mouth as she turned to face Richard. Before I could fully process what was happening, she ran her finger down his chest in a slow, deliberate motion, and then, like it was the most natural thing in the world, she kissed him. I froze. This wasn't a brief or accidental kiss. It was intentional. Their lips locked for what felt like an eternity. When they finally parted, they exchanged a conspiratorial glance, chuckling quietly. Natalie glanced around, checking if anyone had seen them, but I had, and in that moment everything seemed to blur. A slow, simmering rage began to build inside me, but I didn't move. Every instinct screamed at me to confront them, to tear them apart right there, in front of everyone. But that wasn't me. I wasn't impulsive. I was calculated, controlled. As if in some twisted play, they giggled like schoolchildren and with another shared glance, made their way toward the restrooms together. My eyes followed them, a sense of cold detachment settling over me. I stood there, gripping my glass so tightly that my knuckles turned white, watching them disappear down the hallway. I didn't follow. Instead, I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm brewing inside me. They were gone for several minutes, my mind conjuring vivid images of what could be happening behind that door. My wife, the woman I loved and had built a life with, was in there with another man, doing who knows what. And she had the audacity to call me a loser, as if I was some joke in her life. A hollow ache settled in my stomach, but I forced myself to stay calm. Exploding now would accomplish nothing. I needed to think. Natalie had made her choice, and I wasn't going to beg for explanations or grovel for her affection. No, I had a better plan in mind. A short while later, they emerged, smiling as if nothing had happened. They blended back into the crowd, rejoining the festivities like they hadn't just betrayed me. I watched as they mingled, acting like everything was normal. Then Natalie spotted me. Her expression flickered with guilt for a brief moment before she masked it with a tight smile. "There you are," she said as she approached, her voice light. Her eyes scanned my face, searching for any sign that I might have noticed. "I've been looking for you. Are you having fun?" I stared at her, my mind a whirlwind of emotions, but my face remained unreadable. "Yeah," I replied, taking another sip of whiskey, "just watching the night go by." Her eyes searched mine for any hint of suspicion, but I gave her none. And if she thought she had gotten away with it, I was happy to let her believe that for now. Natalie leaned in, giving me a quick kiss on the cheek, her perfume filling the air around me. The scent made me feel sick. "I'm going to chat with a few more people," she said, her voice casual, as if we were just another happy couple enjoying a night out. "I'll catch up with you in a bit." "Sure," I forced a smile. "Take your time." She lingered for a moment as if expecting something more from me. But when I offered nothing, she turned and walked back toward the crowd, her crimson gown trailing elegantly behind her. I watched her go, my mind already forming a plan. This wasn't the time for confrontation. No, now was the time to wait, to let the weight of her actions settle. As the night dragged on, I played my part. I mingled with co-workers, offering smiles when needed, acting as if nothing had changed, though inside I was boiling with anger. Each time I caught sight of Natalie and Richard, it was a painful reminder of the betrayal she assumed I hadn't noticed, but I had, and she would face the consequences. As the gala finally began to wind down, Natalie found me once more, her demeanor more subdued, as if the effects of the alcohol had faded. "Ready to go home?" she asked, her tone softer. "Yeah," I responded, grabbing my coat. "Let's go." The ride home was quiet, both of us lost in thought. I glanced at her occasionally, wondering how long this affair with Richard had been going on, how many lies she had fed me over the years. But I didn't ask, there would be time for that later. When we pulled into the driveway, Natalie was half asleep, her head resting against the window. She stirred as I turned off the engine. "I'm so tired," she mumbled, stretching as she stepped out of the car. "I think I'll just crash as soon as we get inside." The front door clicked shut behind us, the soft thud barely audible over her drunken giggles. And she leaned against the hallway wall, kicking off her heels, letting them clatter to the floor. Her makeup was smudged, her hair a mess, but she didn't seem to care. She staggered toward the bedroom, muttering something incoherent, and I followed, each step reminding me of the betrayal from just hours earlier. She collapsed onto the bed without a word, curling up in the covers like nothing had happened. The room was dark, lit only by the faint moonlight filtering through the curtains. I stood there for a moment, watching her breathing already slow and steady as she drifted off to sleep. It amazed me how easily she could slip into peace after what she had done. The silence between us was suffocating. Normally, we'd at least exchange a few words before bed, even if things were tense. But tonight there was nothing, just a soft snores and the lingering scent of perfume mixed with alcohol. I sat at the edge of the bed for a while, my mind racing. I could still see her with Richard in the ballroom, the way she clung to him, kissed him, whispered things she thought I would say, and my fists clenched, but I forced myself to stay calm. Blowing up now wouldn't get me what I wanted. Real revenge required patience. After an hour, when I was sure she wouldn't wake up, I quietly got to my feet. Moving slowly, I made sure not to make a sound as I grabbed my jacket from the chair. Natalie didn't stir as I slipped out of the bedroom, closing the door softly behind me. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound being the ticking of the kitchen clock as I made my way through the living room, heading for the garage. I didn't turn on any lights I didn't need to. My mind was focused on what needed to be done. Richard's office wasn't far, and I knew the route well. He worked late, often staying long after everyone else had gone home, and that's probably how he and Natalie had gotten close long hours together with no one watching. I pulled the hood of my jacket up as I got into the car, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I knew Richard well, his habits, his routines. He was sloppy in many ways. His personal life was a mess, and from what I had heard, his professional life wasn't much better. Yet I had never acted on that information until tonight. Why? Maybe I hadn't cared enough before, but now I had the perfect motivation. And when I arrived at Richard's office, the building was dark, the parking lot nearly empty. I parked a short distance away and walked the rest of the way. Richard always kept a spare key under a large potted plant by his office door. He had joked about it once during a company party, like it was the funniest thing. I reached down, lifted the plant, and there it was, the key, gleaming faintly in the dim light. I slid the key into the lock, turned it, and the door opened with a soft click. I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me. The office was quiet except for the low hum of the air conditioning. I didn't bother turning on the lights. I knew where everything was. Richard's desk was cluttered with papers, files, and his laptop, but I ignored the mess and went straight for the drawer on the left. And I had seen him open it before, casually stashing sensitive documents as if they didn't matter. The drawer wasn't locked. I pulled it open and found exactly what I was looking for: folders stuffed with papers that had no business being unsecured. Financial records, contracts, and printed emails were carelessly stored due to Richard's laziness. I flipped through the documents, recognizing names of clients and dates of deals that didn't align with the company's official reports. Embezzlement, misappropriation of funds, it was all there, spelled out clearly. I paused, staring at the pile of incriminating evidence. Richard had been misusing the company's money for a long time, and it wouldn't take much to bring him down. But tonight wasn't just about exposing his professional failings, it was about destroying the man who had crossed the line with my wife. So I pulled out my phone and started taking photos of the documents, one by one, page after page, until I had captured everything I needed. In the morning, I'd send these to the right people, the board members, the legal team. Once they saw this, Richard's career would be finished, and there would be no recovery. But I wasn't done yet. I turned to his laptop next. It wasn't password protected, another careless mistake from a man who thought he was untouchable. I opened his email and started scrolling through recent messages. Sure enough, there were emails from Natalie. They weren't explicit, but the flirtation was obvious, dates and times they had met. I forwarded them to myself, knowing they would come in handy later. As I sat in his chair, the weight of my actions began to settle in. This wasn't just about getting revenge on Natalie for betraying me, it was about tearing apart the life they had secretly tried to build behind my back. They believed they could fool me, that I wouldn't notice what was happening. But now I held all the cards, and I was ready to use them. I spent the next hour scouring Richard's computer, gathering more dirt, more pieces of evidence that I could exploit. By the time I was done, I had everything: his dirty secrets, the affair with Natalie, and his financial wrongdoings. It was all in my hands. As I stood up, I gave the office one last look. Richard's recklessness had been his downfall. He made it all too easy. I grabbed one of the folders from his desk, tucking it into my jacket. He wouldn't realize it was missing until it was far too late. Slipping out of the office, I locked the door behind me and replaced the key under the plant. The cool night air hit my face as I walked back to my car, my mind clearer than it had been in weeks. I had the upper hand now, and by tomorrow, everything would be different. When I got home, the house was as silent as I'd left it. Natalie was still fast asleep, completely unaware of what I'd done. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom for a moment, staring at her, wondering how she could sleep so soundly after everything. I placed the folder on my desk in the study, hiding it out of view. Tomorrow I would confront her. Tomorrow her carefully crafted facade would crumble, and she'd realize just how wrong she had been. I slid into bed next to her without a word, not touching her, my mind already mapping out the next moves, the steps that would bring both her and Richard down once and for all. By morning, nothing would be the same. As I lay there, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing, I couldn't help but smile. She thought she had gotten away with it, that her secret was safe, but she had no clue about the storm that was about to destroy her life. Natalie groaned softly as she started to wake, her head throbbing from last night's drinking. The early morning sunlight peeked through the curtains, teasing her eyes open. Her mouth felt dry and her body was weighed down with exhaustion, but an uneasy feeling lingered in her mind. She rolled over, expecting to feel husband next to her, but instead she saw something unexpected: 3 suitcases, neatly packed and stacked by the door. She blinked, confused, her groggy brain struggling to process what she was seeing. "What the?" she muttered, sitting up. As her eyes adjusted, she spotted something else, a folded note on the bedside table. Her heart skipped a beat, a cold dread creeping into her chest. With trembling hands, she reached for the note, her fingers fumbling as she opened it. Her message was short, brutal, and final: "You have until midnight to leave. Otherwise, I'm exposing you and your little lover boy. Your game is over." Natalie's breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening as she stared at the words. Her heart pounded, panic rising in her chest. "No, no, no," she whispered, her voice shaky. "This can't be happening." She scrambled out of bed, nearly tripping over the sheets in her haste to stand. Her head swam, and she had to steady herself against the wall, the hangover making it hard to think clearly. But the fear flooding her body was more than enough to push her forward. Frantically, she stumbled toward the living room, her mind racing. Was this real? Could Daniel be serious? She couldn't believe it. Her husband had always been so mild, so quiet, that he had never given any indication that he knew about her affair with Richard. And Richard, he wasn't supposed to be a part of this. It was meant to be their secret. But when she burst into the living room, her worst fears were confirmed. Richard was sprawled out on the couch, his shirt rumpled, tie loosened, and unconscious. His arm dangled off the side, clutching a manila folder, its contents spilling out slightly. And Natalie's heart sank at the sight. She knew exactly what was in that folder. Her legs gave out, and she clutched the back of the couch for support, her breath coming in shallow, erratic gasps. Oh my God, she whispered, realizing this wasn't just a confrontation, this was her entire life falling apart. She rushed to Richard's side, shaking his shoulder desperately. "Richard, wake up," she hissed, her voice filled with panic. He didn't stir. She shook him harder, her pulse racing. "Richard, wake up," she repeated louder this time, but he remained unresponsive. Her mind spun in confusion. How had he ended up here? What had Daniel done? Had he drugged him? She grabbed the folder from Richard's limp hand, her fingers trembling as she opened it. The first few pages sent a chill down her spine. Financial records, emails, photos, it was all there. Every shady deal Richard had been involved in, every message they had exchanged, every trace of their affair. "No, no, no," Natalie whimpered, her voice breaking as she flipped through the damning evidence. This can't be happening. The realization hit her like a freight train. Daniel had been watching all along, and now he had everything. The evidence, the power, the control, it was all in his hands. Her breaths came in short, shallow gasps as she staggered to her feet, backing away from the couch. Her mind raced, desperate for a way out. She glanced around the room, half expecting Daniel to step out of the shadows at any moment, but he was nowhere to be seen. The house was eerily quiet, save for the sound of her own frantic breathing. She darted back into the bedroom, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she grabbed the phone from the nightstand. She needed to call anyone. Maybe a lawyer, maybe someone who could help. She couldn't let Daniel destroy her like this. She couldn't let everything fall apart over one mistake. Her fingers fumbled over the screen as she dialed Richard's number, hoping, praying that he would somehow wake up and answer. But as she stared at his unconscious form on the couch, she knew it was pointless. The call went to voicemail, and she cursed under her breath. Natalie, she murmured to herself as she paced back and forth. She couldn't just leave not like this. She needed to talk to Daniel, to try and fix things, to convince him not to follow through with his threats. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a way to salvage the situation. Perhaps he hadn't sent the evidence out yet. Without wasting another moment, she bolted toward the front door, her mind racing, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to find Daniel, talk to him, beg for his forgiveness if that's what it took. Reaching for the doorknob, her hand shook so much it took her 2 tries to open it. As she stepped outside, the bright morning sunlight hit her, momentarily blinding her. She squinted, her head aching from the hangover, and the adrenaline coursing through her veins made her feel nauseous. But she couldn't stop now. She wouldn't let her life collapse without a fight. She hurried to the driveway, her eyes scanning the street for any sign of Daniel, but his car was gone. He wasn't home. Panic gripped her once more. Where could he be? What was he planning? Had he already left to expose her and Richard to everyone, the company, their friends, the world? Daniel. She called out into the empty driveway, her voice breaking, but there was no answer, just the mocking quiet of a suburban street going about its day. She clutched her phone tightly, her fingers hovering over the call button. Should she try to call him? Would he even answer? What if he was already at the office, handing over the evidence? Her mind spun with countless possibilities, each one worse than the last. With trembling hands, she dialed his number. It rang once, twice, then went straight to voicemail. "Daniel, please," she begged in the phone, her voice cracking. "Please don't do this. Let's talk, okay? I'm sorry, I didn't mean for it to get this far. Please, just come home and we'll figure it out. I'll do whatever you want, just don't ruin us." She ended the call, feeling her heart sink as the desperate tone of her voice replayed in her mind. She had no other choice now. Daniel was in control, and if she didn't find a way to stop him, her life would be over by the end of the day. Natalie collapsed onto the front steps, her head in her hands, the weight of her reality finally crashing down on her. Her mind raced, trying to think of what to do next, but all she could feel was the crushing realization that her world was unraveling, and there was nothing she could do to prevent it. As the cool morning air brushed against her skin, one terrifying thought echoed in her mind: she was out of time. The door swung open with a bang, and Natalie's panicked voice filled the room. "Daniel!" she screamed, her footsteps echoing across the hardwood floor as she rushed into the bedroom. Tears streamed down her face, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. I stood there, arms crossed, watching her fall apart in front of me. She dropped to her knees, grabbing my legs as if they were the last thing keeping her afloat. "Please, we can fix this," she sobbed, her voice hoarse. "I made a mistake. I was drunk. I wasn't thinking. I love you, I swear." Her words tumbled out in a frantic rush, as if saying more would somehow undo the damage she had caused. But I didn't flinch, I didn't blink. I stared down at her, my expression cold like stone. The same woman who had dismissed me so arrogantly the night before was now pleading for mercy at my feet. The irony was not lost on me. "Fix it." I finally spoke, my voice low, too calm. "After what I saw, after what I heard, do you really think there's anything left to fix? Do you have any idea how long you've been lying to me? You destroyed everything, Natalie. Everything." She sobbed harder, her tears soaking into my pants as she clung to me. "I was lost, Daniel. It didn't mean anything, I swear. It was a stupid mistake. Please, give me another chance. I'll do anything." Her voice cracked with desperation, every word dripping with fear. Her grip tightened around my legs as if holding on to me could somehow save the life she was so terrified of losing. I knelt down in front of her like Tinker Chin so our eyes met. Her face, tear-streaked and swollen from crying, looked at me with a mixture of hope and terror. I felt nothing. The anger that had raged inside me the night before had turned into a cold, sharp clarity. She wasn't begging because she loved me, she was begging because she had been caught. "You're going to pay for this, Natalie," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but each word hit her like a punch. "I don't want your apologies. I don't want your tears. I want you out by midnight." Her eyes widened in horror, her lips trembling. "No, Daniel, please don't do this. Don't throw everything away. I can change. We can work through this. Please, don't destroy me," she pleaded, her voice shaking. But I stood up, letting her chin drop as I straightened. Destroy you? I repeated, raising an eyebrow. You destroyed yourself the moment you decided I wasn't enough. Now you'll face the consequences. I turned my back on her, walking toward the door. Behind me, her sobs grew louder, more desperate. She scrambled to her feet and rushed toward me, grabbing my arm. No, wait, she cried, pulling me back. You can't do this. You can't ruin my life like this, Daniel, please. I'll lose everything, my job, my reputation, everything. That's the idea, I replied coldly, shaking her off as I stepped out of the bedroom. Her cries echoed down the hallway as I walked away, but I didn't stop. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me hesitate. I entered the living room, my mind already turning to the next steps. The manila folder with all of Richard's dirty secrets still lay on the coffee table where I had left it. He glanced at the clock. There were still hours before the deadline I had given her, but I wasn't concerned. She could beg and plead all she wanted, her time was up. So behind me I heard her footsteps again, slower this time, as she followed me into the room. Daniel, please, she whispered, her voice broken, barely a shadow of the woman who had mocked me the night before. I can't lose everything, Natalie said softly, pacing back and forth, her voice filled with desperation. I know I messed up, but you don't have to do this. I turned to face her, arms crossed. And why shouldn't I asked, my tone sharp. She hesitated, her lips trembling as she searched for something to say. Because I love you, she finally whispered. I let out a short, bitter laugh. Love? You think this is about love? You didn't think about love when you were with Richard. You didn't think about me at all. So don't stand there and tell me you love me just because you're scared. Her face crumpled, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. I was confused. I wasn't thinking clearly. Please, give me another chance. I'll quit my job. I'll cut all ties with Richard. We can start over. Please, Daniel, don't destroy us. I shook my head, her words sliding off me, leaving me cold. There is no us anymore, Natalie. You ended that. The only thing left for you to do now is pack your things and be gone by midnight. She buried her head in her hands, her body shaking with sobs. Where am I supposed to go? She whimpered, her voice barely audible. What am I supposed to do? I shrugged indifferently. That's not my problem anymore. Turning away, I head for the door, feeling no need to say anything. She had made her choices, and now she had to face the consequences. Before I reached the door, I heard her footsteps quicken behind me. She grabbed my arm with more force than before. Wait, she cried, her voice laced with panic. Please don't tell the company. I'll lose everything. Richard will lose everything too. You don't have to do this. I stopped and turned to look at her one last time. You didn't think about that before you slept with him, I replied, my voice cold. Now you both have to deal with the fallout. She released my arm, her hands falling limp at her sides, as if the last bit of fight had drained out of her. Her shoulders sagged, her body trembling. As the reality hit her, there was nothing left to change my mind. Please, Daniel, she whispered one last time, her voice weak and defeated. But I didn't respond. I simply walked out, leaving her standing in the middle of the room, shattered and alone. As the door closed behind me, an unexpected sense of relief washed over me. The lies, the betrayal, everything was out in the open now, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. I could still hear Natalie's muffled sobs through the walls, but I didn't look back. She had made her bed, and now she would have to lie in it. When midnight arrived, her entire world would crumble, and there would be no saving it. Richard stirred, his head throbbing as though someone had taken a hammer to it. The sunlight streaming through the curtains felt like needles stabbing in light as his skull. Groaning, he pressed his palms against his temples, trying to push away the pain. He couldn't remember drinking that much, could he? Everything was a blur. Natalie by his side, laughing, stealing moments away from prying eyes. But there was something else, something unsettling lingering in the back of his mind. He blinked hard, trying to clear his vision, and that's when he saw her, Natalie, sitting on the floor by the couch, her knees drawn to her chest. Her face was pale, streaked with dried tears, and her eyes wide with fear as she stared at him like she was waiting for her execution. Morning, he muttered, his voice rough from a night of drinking and little sleep, but he rubbed his face, trying to figure out why she looked so terrified. That's when he felt the weight in his hand. Slowly, he glanced down and saw the folder resting on his lap. His foggy brain struggled to make sense of it. Flipping it open, he casually expected to find some work papers or notes from the office, but the first page made his blood turn cold. So what the hell is this? He croaked, sitting up suddenly. He fumbled through the documents, his fingers trembling as he recognized the emails detailing money transfers, shady business deals, and even worse, intimate messages between him and Natalie. It was all there, laid out in brutal detail. Every misstep, every really illicit act he thought he had hidden from the world. Natalie flinched at his reaction. He did it, she whispered, barely audible. Daniel found everything. Richard's mind raced, the panic rising in his chest. How the hell did he get this? He shouted, his voice climbing in pitch, panic infecting every word. His heart pounded so hard he could barely hear himself think. This wasn't just proof of an affair, this was enough to completely ruin him, both personally and professionally. I don't know, Natalie replied, her voice shaky. She looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen from crying. He found out about us last night, and he's going to destroy us. Richard shot up from the couch, fully awake now, gripping the folder as though it might disappear if he didn't hold on to it. No, 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 he muttered, pacing the room like a trapped animal. This can't be happening. There has to be a way out of this. He reached for his phone on the coffee table, desperate to find some way to contain the situation before it spiraled further. His heart sank as the screen lit up dozens of missed calls, emails and messages, most of them from the company's board members, a few from his lawyer, and one from his wife. Seeing her name made his throat tighten, but he couldn't bring himself to open her message. "What did you do, Richard?" Natalie asked, her voice barely more than a whisper as she watched him unravel. She stood, moving cautiously toward him, but her presence barely registered with him. He scrolled through the messages, dread settling deeper with each new notification. Then a call came through. Richard stared at the screen, recognizing the name immediately as lawyer Alex. Without thinking, he answered, putting the phone to his ear. Richard, Alex's voice was strained, filled with frustration and urgency. "What the hell is going on? The board's ready to tear you apart. They've been hit with evidence of your indiscretions and financial misconduct. I've been fielding calls all morning. This is bad, really bad." Richard could barely find the words to respond. How did they get this?" he stammered. "I don't know," Alex snapped, "but whoever leaked this has you pinned down. It's everything: personal matters, financial mismanagement, even embezzlement. You're looking at a criminal investigation, Richard. You need to get ahead of this before the media devours you." Richard's knees buckled, and he collapsed back onto the couch, holding his head in one hand while the phone remained clutched in the other. "How the hell do I get ahead of this?" he asked, his voice trembling with desperation. "Could you start by getting your story straight and pray the board doesn't cut you loose completely?" Alex replied, his voice firm. "Right now they're looking for someone to blame, and that someone is you." Richard's vision blurred as the weight of the situation closed in on him. He ended the call without saying anything more, dropping the phone onto the table. His career was slipping away, falling apart like sand between his fingers. Across the room, Natalie stood in silence, wringing her hands, looking smaller than before. Her confidence and sense of independence were gone. "What are we going to do?" she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost inaudible. Richard turned toward her, venom in his eyes. "We," he spat, glaring at her. "There's no we anymore, Natalie. Do you really think I care about what happens to you now?" This he pointed accusingly at her. "This is your fault." His face twisted in fury, and Natalie recoiled, tears welling up once more. "I didn't know this would happen. I didn't want this, Richard." "You didn't want this," Richard snapped, his voice filled with bitter sarcasm. "What did you want, Natalie? A bit of fun, some excitement on the side. Well, congratulations, now we're both ruined." Natalie took a step back, her back pressing against the wall as she tried to suppress her sobs. "We can fix this," she stammered, her voice pleading. "We have to." "There's no fixing this," Richard shouted, slamming the folder onto the coffee table. Papers scattered across the surface, the evidence of his downfall laid bare between them. "Do you even understand what's at stake here? My job, my reputation, my freedom, they're all at risk. And you're just another problem I have to deal with." Natalie's face crumbled as his words struck her like a physical blow. "I didn't mean for this to happen. Her voice trailed off, unable to find the words to explain away the disaster they were in. Richard paced the room, muttering to himself, trying to think of a way out. "I need to make some calls. Damage control. Maybe I can salvage something." He grabbed his phone, ignoring Natalie completely. She watched him, feeling the crushing weight of guilt. Everything had spiraled out of control so quickly. Last night they had been laughing, sure that no one would ever find out about their affair. Now everything had fallen apart, and she had no idea how to stop it. After a tense silence, she asked in a whisper, "What's going to happen to us?" Richard stopped in his tracks, his expression dark as he turned to her. "There's no us anymore, Natalie. Whatever we had, it's gone. You should start worrying about your own mess because I'm done cleaning it up for you." His words were cold and final. Natalie felt her heart shatter all over again, not just from his anger, but from the realization that there was no escape from the nightmare they had created. She was just as ruined as he was. She sat down on the couch beside him, her hands trembling as she stared at the scattered papers. "What do we do now?" Richard didn't look at her. He stood up, grabbing his coat from the back of a chair. "You do whatever you want. I'm going to try to save what's left of my life." Without another word, he walked out the door, leaving Natalie alone in the ruins of their affair. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the apartment, a final punctuation mark on the life they had destroyed. As the silence settled in, Natalie stared at the mess of papers on the table, her mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. Everything was ruined, and there's no way to fix it. The house felt emptier than it ever had. Natalie had been gone for hours, and with her departure came a strange, hollow silence. For the first time in years, the tension, the arguments, the lies, they were all gone. I could finally breathe again, but the heaviness in my chest remained as I stared at the now vacant room. The suitcase had left impressions on the floor, a faint reminder of the life we had once shared. It was surreal to think that just days ago I had been her husband, unaware of the depth of her betrayal. When I told her to leave, she hadn't fought. She hadn't screamed or argued. She had stood there, hollow-eyed and broken, knowing she had no more cards to play. When she left, the door didn't slam it closed softly, the last sound marking the end of our marriage. That evening, I found myself pacing the living room, replaying the events of the past few days in my mind. Part of me still couldn't believe how easily everything had fallen into place. The quiet revenge I had planned had worked almost too smoothly. Richard's fall had been swift, his sins exposed for the entire company to see. After the initial blow, I didn't even need to do anything else. The system took care of the rest. Richard's financial misconduct had been far worse than I expected. Once I sent the evidence to the board, it took them less than a week to terminate him. I never heard directly from Richard after that. He vanished, likely hiding somewhere, trying to salvage the remnants of his once promising career. The rumors at the company gala had spread like wildfire, fueled by whispers of the affair, but it was his reckless handling of company funds that sealed his fate. I half expected Natalie to try to contact me after she left, but she never did. Maybe she had finally accepted the reality of what she had done. Maybe she understood that there was no coming back from her betrayal. Or perhaps, like Richard, she was too ashamed to face me. Weeks passed, and news of Richard's firing became public knowledge. His name was dragged through the mud, not just for the affair but for the financial scandals that followed. The company's board made sure his reputation was thoroughly destroyed. Everyone who once respected him now saw him as a pariah. As word spread, Richard became a cautionary tale in our industry, a lesson in what happens when greed and recklessness catch up with you. Meanwhile, Natalie faded into obscurity, her life shattered by the scandal. She tried to pick up the pieces, but it was as if the world had turned its back on her. Former friends distanced themselves, afraid to be associated with her name, now synonymous with betrayal. Even in our social circles, no one wanted to be seen with her. Occasionally, I'd hear whispers about how she was getting by, taking odd jobs and moving from place to place, but she was just a ghost now. Without Richard's success to lean on, she was left to fend for herself in a world that no longer welcomed her. I never felt the urge to check up on her, not out of spite, but because I understood there was no point. She had made her decisions, and now she had to face the consequences. There was no joy in seeing someone suffer. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about moving forward. One evening I found myself in my new apartment, a place that already felt more like home than the house I had once shared with Natalie ever did. Sitting by the large window with a glass of bourbon in hand, I watched the sun sink below the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink as the warmth of the day gave way to the coolness of the night. It was peaceful, a word I hadn't associated with my life in a long time. The apartment was modest, but it was mine, entirely mine. There was no tension, no secrets lurking in the corners. I could wake up each day knowing I wasn't living inside someone else's lies. That sense of freedom was something I hadn't truly grasped until now. As I sipped my drink, I reflected on the months that had led me to this point. Natalie's betrayal had been a devastating blow, but it had also granted me clarity. She had released me from a life I hadn't realized was stifling me. Though I had once loved her, that love had long been buried beneath the weight of her dishonesty. In a way, I no longer hated her. I felt pity for her, yes, but not hate. Hate would mean she still had some control over me, and she didn't. Not anymore. I had reclaimed control over my life, something I had lost long before her affair. Through her betrayal, she had inadvertently returned my independence. The sunset outside was stunning, and as the last rays of light faded away, I experienced a strange sense of finality. There were no more loose ends, no secrets left to uncover. Everything was out in the open, and I had not only survived it, I had come out stronger. The phone buzzed on the table next to me, a message from an old friend inviting me out for drinks later that week. I smiled, feeling a sense of lightness in my chest that came from knowing I could say yes without hesitation. without the weight of worrying about what I might come home to. I finished my drink, the ice clinking softly in the glass as I stood and stretched. My new life stretched before me, full of possibilities and free from the toxicity that had once poisoned my marriage. There were no more regrets, only the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing I had weathered the storm, and on the other side I had found peace. In the end, Natalie and Richard had destroyed themselves. I didn't need to bring them down, they had done that all on their own. And now, as I stood in my apartment, the world calm and still around me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt free.